It was 4:47 inches the morning when Richard Cole's hand started shaking. Not from the cold air seeping through the marble hallways of his $40 million estate, not from the bourbon he'd been nursing since midnight, but from something far more primal, something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Fear. Pure, suffocating fear. Just 8 hours earlier, he had done something he thought was justified, something he believed was necessary to protect what was his. He had grabbed Maria Santos by the arm, looked her dead in the eyes, and told her she was nothing. A thief, a liar, someone beneath him. And then he watched as his security team escorted her through the rain-soaked driveway, past the iron gates, into the darkness of a city that swallows people whole. He remembered the way she turned back once, just once, her face streaked with tears and rain, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. And he remembered slamming the door shut, convinced he'd never think about her again. But now, as dawn crept over the Philadelphia skyline and the first rays of light touched his windows, Richard Cole stood in his entryway staring at something that made his blood run cold. A single muddy footprint, leading from his front door toward the staircase. And it wasn't his. You see, this isn't just a story about a billionaire and his maid. This is a story about what happens when power meets pride, when assumptions become weapons, and when a single night of rage unravels a man's entire existence. Because what Richard didn't know, what none of us could have predicted, was that the woman he threw away like garbage was about to become the only person who could save him, or destroy him. And before the sun fully rose that morning, he would discover a truth so devastating it would bring him to his knees in front of the world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back. Let's go back to where it all began, 3 months before that terrible night, when a quiet woman from a small town in Pennsylvania walked through those same iron gates for the very first time, carrying nothing but a worn suitcase and a heart full of hope she would soon regret ever having. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Maria Santos was 32 years old when she arrived at the Cole estate on a bright Tuesday morning in early September. She'd taken 2 buses and a train from Harrisburg, leaving behind her mother's small apartment where the wallpaper was peeling and the heat barely worked in winter. Her mother, Claudia, had stage 3 lung cancer, and the medical bills were piling up faster than Maria could count. She'd worked 3 jobs back home, a cashier at the grocery store, a night shift at the diner, and weekend cleaning at the church. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. So when her cousin told her about a live-in housekeeping position at a private estate in Philadelphia, Maria didn't hesitate. The pay was more than she'd ever made, enough to cover her mother's treatments and maybe, just maybe, save a little for the future. She didn't know anything about Richard Cole except that he was rich, really rich, the kind of rich that made the news when he bought buildings or donated to museums. She imagined he'd be busy, distant, the kind of employer who barely noticed the people who cleaned his floors and cooked his meals. And for the first few weeks, she was right. Richard Cole was 56 years old and hadn't smiled genuinely in a decade. He'd built his empire from nothing, starting with a single construction contract in his 20s and growing it into Cole Industries, a real estate and development giant worth billions. He owned hotels in 5 countries, shopping centers across the East Coast, and enough residential properties to house a small city. But success had cost him everything soft in his life. His wife, Caroline, had died 7 years earlier from an aneurysm, sudden and cruel, leaving him alone in a house too big for one person. They'd never had children. She'd wanted to, but he'd always said later, always said when the business stabilized, when he had more time he never found. After she died, Richard threw himself into work, 16-hour days, board meetings, acquisitions, mergers, anything to avoid the silence of his own home. He barely spoke to his household staff except to give instructions or complain when something wasn't done to his standards. He ate his meals alone, slept 4 hours a night, and trusted no one. That was his life. Cold, controlled, predictable. Maria's first impression of Richard was that he looked tired. Not just physically exhausted, but tired in his soul, like someone who'd been running for so long he'd forgotten why he started. She saw him mostly in passing during those early weeks. Him, heading out in tailored suits before sunrise, her quietly cleaning the library or preparing his breakfast in the vast kitchen. The estate had other staff, a rotating crew of cleaners, a part-time chef, a groundskeeper. But Maria was the only live-in employee, which meant she saw more of Richard's private life than anyone else. And what she saw broke her heart. She'd find him asleep at his desk at 3 in the morning, paperwork spread around him like fallen leaves. She'd notice he barely touched the elaborate meals prepared for him, just pushed food around his plate before abandoning it. Once, she found a framed photo of a woman, beautiful with kind eyes, tucked in a drawer in his study, face down, as if he couldn't bear to look at it. That was Caroline, the other housekeeper told her. He hasn't been the same since she passed, acts like he doesn't need anyone, but we all know better. Some people bury their grief in bottles. Mr. Cole buries his in buildings. Maria understood grief. She understood what it meant to lose someone slowly, to watch them fade, to feel helpless. So she didn't judge Richard for his coldness. She simply did her job with quiet efficiency, made sure his coffee was ready at 5:30 every morning, kept his spaces immaculate, and stayed invisible. But invisibility only works until someone decides to see you. And that moment came on a rainy October evening when Maria made her first real mistake. Richard had hosted a small dinner party, 8 guests, mostly business associates and their spouses. The kind of evening where every detail mattered because deals worth millions could hinge on impressions. Maria had helped the chef prepare and serve, moving through the dining room like a ghost, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates. Everything was perfect, until she was carrying a tray of dessert plates back to the kitchen and didn't see the edge of an antique rug that had curled up near the doorway. Her foot caught. She stumbled. The tray flew from her hands, and 6 plates of chocolate torte crashed onto the marble floor in an explosion of porcelain and cream. The dining room went silent. Maria froze, her heart hammering, staring at the mess spreading across the floor. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, but the only gaze that mattered was Richard's. And when she looked up, his expression was carved from ice. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He simply stood, excused himself from the table with a tight smile, and walked toward her. His voice was low, controlled, but every word landed like a slap. Do you have any idea how much those plates cost? Do you have any concept of what tonight meant? Those guests expect perfection, not incompetence. Maria's throat tightened. I'm so sorry, Mr. Cole. It was an accident. I'll clean it up right away. I'll replace them. I'll work extra hours to pay for them. Richard's jaw clenched. You'll clean it up now. And tomorrow we'll discuss whether you're capable of continuing this position. Then he turned and walked back to his guests, his smile returning as if nothing had happened, as if she didn't exist. Maria spent the next hour scrubbing chocolate from marble on her hands and knees while laughter drifted from the dining room. She didn't cry until she was alone in her small room above the garage, where she pressed her face into her pillow and let the shame pour out. The next morning, Richard called her into his office. She stood in front of his massive mahogany desk, hands clasped, bracing for termination. But instead, he surprised her. You're lucky, he said without looking up from his computer. My chef vouched for you. Said you've been reliable. That last night was unusual. So you'll stay. But understand this, there is no room for carelessness in my home. Everything here has value, and I expect that value to be respected. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Maria whispered. Good. You're dismissed. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. And Maria, her name sounded strange in his mouth, foreign, as if he'd never said it before. Next time you break something, you won't get a second chance. She nodded and left, her hands trembling. But somewhere beneath the fear was something else. Relief, gratitude, and a strange determination to prove she belonged here. To show this cold, broken man that she wasn't careless, that she wasn't worthless. She had no idea that determination would nearly cost her everything. Over the following weeks, something shifted. Maria couldn't put her finger on when it started, but she began to notice Richard watching her sometimes, not with suspicion or anger, but with something closer to curiosity. as if he was trying to figure out a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. She'd catch him pausing in doorways when she was arranging flowers in the foyer, or glancing up from his paperwork when she brought his evening tea. Once, when she was dusting the shelves in his study, he spoke without warning. "You're very quiet." She nearly dropped the duster. "I try not to disturb you, Mr. Cole. Most people make noise just to remind me they exist. You don't." "Is that a cultural thing?" Maria hesitated, unsure if he was genuinely curious or testing her. "I just believe in doing my work without drawing attention. That's how I was raised." He nodded slowly. "Smart. The world's too loud already." Then he returned to his laptop, and she finished cleaning in silence. But the interaction stayed with her, replaying in her mind because it was the first time he'd spoken to her like a person instead of a function. After that, the moments multiplied. He asked where she was from. She told him about Harrisburg, about her mother. He didn't respond with pity, just a thoughtful nod. A week later, she found an envelope on the kitchen counter with her name on it. Inside was a check for $2,000 and a note in sharp handwriting for medical expenses. "And before you refuse, consider it an advance on excellent work." She stared at that check for 10 minutes, tears blurring the numbers. She'd never told him about her mother's cancer specifically, just mentioned she was sick, which meant he'd been paying attention, remembering details he had no obligation to remember. And for the first time since arriving at the estate, Maria felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, Richard Cole wasn't as cold as he pretended to be. That beneath the armor was someone still capable of kindness. She had no way of knowing that hope was about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine, and that the man who'd just shown her the first real generosity of her life would soon become her worst nightmare. It was mid-November when things started to go wrong. Richard's business hit a rough patch. A deal in Atlantic City fell through, costing him millions, and a lawsuit from a former partner was dragging through the courts, threatening to expose financial irregularities that could damage his reputation. He became more withdrawn, more irritable, snapping at staff over minor issues, working even later into the night. Maria watched him unravel from a distance, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands shook slightly when he poured his third scotch of the evening. She wanted to help somehow, to ease his burden, but she didn't know how. So she did what she could. Made sure his favorite meals were ready, kept his spaces peaceful, left small notes of encouragement tucked into his daily planner, just simple things like "you're stronger than you think" or "tomorrow will be better." She never signed them, but she suspected he knew they were from her because once, she found one of the notes smoothed out and placed under a paperweight on his desk, as if he'd kept it. But kindness has limits, and Richard Cole's limits were about to be reached. The breaking point came on a cold December night, 3 days before Christmas. Richard was hosting a small gathering, just a handful of close associates and their families, an attempt to maintain appearances despite his mounting stress. Maria had spent the entire day preparing, decorating the house with tasteful garland and lights, coordinating with the chef, ensuring every detail was flawless. The evening started smoothly. Guests arrived, champagne flowed, conversation hummed through the grand living room. Maria moved through the crowd serving hors d'oeuvres, her presence barely noticed, exactly as it should be. But around 9 o'clock, Richard's personal assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Veronica who'd worked for him for 5 years, pulled him aside into his study. Maria happened to be passing the door with a tray of empty glasses when she heard Veronica's voice, urgent and low. "Richard, we have a problem. I can't find your mother's diamond bracelet, the one you were going to give to Margaret tonight as a Christmas gift. I had it in the safe this morning, and now it's gone." Maria's blood went cold. She froze in the hallway, the tray suddenly heavy in her hands. She heard Richard's sharp intake of breath. "What do you mean, gone?" Veronica's voice dropped even lower. "I mean, it's not in the safe. I've checked 3 times. The only people with access to that safe are you, me, and whoever cleans your study." Maria's heart began to race. She cleaned the study. Every day. She was the only person besides Richard who had regular, unsupervised access to that room, and she knew with sudden, horrible certainty, where this was going. She wanted to walk away, to disappear before the accusation came, but her feet wouldn't move. Then she heard Richard's voice, cold and sharp as a blade. "Get Maria. Now." Veronica found her 30 seconds later, still standing in the hallway, tray clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Mr. Cole wants to see you." In his study. Immediately. Maria set the tray down carefully, her hands shaking, and followed Veronica down the hall, every step feeling like a march toward execution. Richard was standing behind his desk when she entered, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Veronica closed the door behind them, and suddenly the room felt impossibly small, the air thick and suffocating. Richard's eyes locked onto Maria with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the floor. "A very expensive piece of jewelry has gone missing from my personal safe," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The only people with access to this room are myself, Veronica, and you. Now, I'm going to ask you once, and I suggest you think very carefully before you answer. Did you take my mother's diamond bracelet?" Maria's mind went blank, shock and fear colliding in her chest. "No, Mr. Cole. I would never. I swear I didn't take anything." Richard's expression didn't change. "You expect me to believe that? You, who I've given chance after chance, who I've helped financially, who has been in and out of this room unsupervised for months." Maria's voice cracked. "I understand how it looks, but I promise you, I didn't take anything. Please, you have to believe me." Veronica stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Richard, I hate to say it, but the bracelet was definitely in the safe this morning. I checked it myself before the guests arrived. And Maria was the only other person in this study today." Maria spun toward her. "That's not true. You were in here too. You're in here all the time." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "Are you seriously accusing me? I've worked for Mr. Cole for 5 years. I've never given him a single reason to doubt my integrity. You've been here 3 months. Richard's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Enough. Maria, empty your pockets. Now." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You think I have it on me? Just do it." With shaking hands, Maria pulled out her pockets, turned them inside out. "Nothing." Richard's jaw tightened. "Your room. We're searching your room." Terror flooded through her. "Mr. Cole, please, I didn't take anything. You don't need to," I said. "We're searching your room. Now. And if I find that bracelet, I'm calling the police. Do you understand me? You'll be arrested for theft. You'll go to prison. And every cent I've given you will be considered restitution." Maria felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She followed Richard and Veronica out of the study, past the guests who had started to notice something was wrong, their conversations dropping to whispers as they watched the procession toward the back of the house. Maria's small room above the garage was neat and sparse. Just a bed, a dresser, a small desk, and a few personal items. Richard tore through it with methodical precision, pulling open drawers, checking under the mattress, rifling through her clothes. Veronica stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching with an expression that looked almost satisfied. Maria stood frozen in the corner, humiliation washing over her in waves as her private space was violated, her few possessions scattered across the floor. And then Richard opened the drawer of her nightstand and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box. Maria's world stopped. "No," she whispered. "That's not. I've never seen that before." Richard opened the box. Inside, nestled on white satin, was an ornate diamond bracelet, glittering under the harsh light. The room went silent except for Maria's ragged breathing. Richard's face transformed into something ugly, something Maria had never seen before. "You lying, ungrateful thief." Maria backed against the wall, shaking her head violently. "I didn't put that there, I swear. Someone else must have. Please, Mr. Cole, you have to believe me." But Richard wasn't listening anymore. He'd already made up his mind, already convicted her in the court of his own rage and betrayal. "Get out," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "Get out of my house. Right now. You have 10 minutes to pack whatever you can carry. and then you're gone. If I ever see you again, if you ever try to contact me or come near this property, I will have you arrested. Do you understand me? Maria, you need to leave. Right now before I change my mind and call the police anyway. Tears were streaming down Maria's face now, her voice breaking. Please, Mr. Cole. I have nowhere to go, my mother. I need this job. Please just listen to me. 10 minutes, he repeated, then turned and walked out, Veronica following behind him, leaving Maria alone in her destroyed room with a crime she didn't commit and a future that had just collapsed around her. She packed in a daze, shoving clothes into her old suitcase with shaking hands, her mind unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. She'd done nothing wrong. Nothing. And yet here she was being thrown out like trash, labeled a thief, her reputation destroyed. When she stumbled down the stairs with her suitcase, Richard was waiting by the front door, 2 security guards flanking him. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just gestured toward the door. Maria walked through it into the cold December night, rain starting to fall in sheets, soaking through her thin jacket within seconds. Behind her, she heard the massive door slam shut, the lock clicking into place with a finality that echoed in her chest. She stood there for a moment on the circular driveway, rain mixing with tears on her face, staring at the iron gates slowly opening to expel her, and she realized she had exactly $43 in her wallet, no family nearby, and no idea where she was going to sleep tonight. So she started walking, one foot in front of the other, away from the only security she'd known in months, away from the man she'd started to care about despite his coldness, away from any hope of clearing her name. She walked for 3 hours through the rain-soaked streets of Philadelphia, her suitcase wheels catching on every crack in the sidewalk, her clothes drenched and clinging to her skin. She tried calling her cousin, the one who told her about the job, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried 2 more numbers, friends from back home, but it was nearly midnight, and no one answered. Desperation clawed at her throat as she realized she had no options, nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Finally, shivering violently and barely able to feel her fingers, she found a small park with a covered bus shelter and collapsed onto the bench inside, pulling her suitcase close like a shield. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just sat there in the dark watching cars pass by, their headlights cutting through the rain, each one making her flinch because part of her kept expecting Richard to come after her, to realize his mistake, to apologize. But no one came. The night stretched on forever, cold and empty and cruel, and somewhere around 4 in the morning, Maria made a decision. She was going to survive this. Somehow, she was going to prove her innocence and make Richard Cole see the truth, even if it killed her. But what Maria didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that at that exact moment, Richard Cole was standing in his study staring at the diamond bracelet in his hands, and something about the whole situation was starting to feel wrong. He'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced of her guilt when he found the bracelet in her room. But now, in the silence of his empty house with his guests long gone and only his thoughts for company, doubt was creeping in. Maria had seemed genuinely shocked when he opened that drawer, genuinely terrified. Not the calculated fear of someone caught, but the raw panic of someone being framed. And her reaction, the way she'd kept insisting someone else must have put it there, hadn't that been exactly what an innocent person would say? He sat down heavily in his desk chair, turning the bracelet over in his fingers. Veronica had been so quick to suggest searching Maria's room, so certain they'd find something. And she'd been the last person to confirm the bracelet was in the safe that morning. Richard's stomach twisted. No, he told himself. Veronica had been with him for 5 years. She was loyal, trustworthy, essential to his operation. Maria was the obvious suspect, the new employee, the one with financial problems. It made sense. It had to make sense. But sleep didn't come easy that night. And when it finally did, Richard dreamed of Caroline, of her disappointed eyes staring at him across an impossible distance. And when he woke at dawn, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The next morning, Richard went through his routine on autopilot. Coffee at 5:30, emails by 6, a call with his lawyers at 7. But his mind kept drifting back to Maria, to the sound of her voice breaking when she begged him to listen, to the image of her walking out into the storm with nothing. He told himself he'd done the right thing, that he'd protected his property and his integrity. But the justification felt hollow. Around 9, Veronica arrived for work, perfectly composed as always, and joined him in his study to go over the day's schedule. She didn't mention Maria at all, didn't ask if he'd filed a police report or if he regretted his decision, just moved through the agenda items with professional efficiency. And that silence, that complete lack of acknowledgement, bothered Richard more than he wanted to admit. "Veronica," he said abruptly, interrupting her mid-sentence about a meeting with investors. "Do you think we should have called the police last night instead of just throwing her out?" Veronica barely paused. "I think you showed remarkable restraint, Richard. Most people in your position would have had her arrested immediately. You gave her a chance to leave with some dignity. But what if she tries to claim unemployment or damages? What if she goes to the media?" Veronica's smile was thin. "With all due respect, who's going to believe a maid over? You? You have evidence, you have witnesses. If she tries anything, your legal team will crush her." Richard nodded slowly, but the conversation left a sour taste in his mouth. He spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but his concentration was shattered, his thoughts returning again and again to Maria. Where had she gone? Did she have family to take her in? Was she safe? By evening, he'd convinced himself he was being ridiculous, that his guilt was just misplaced emotion, stress from the lawsuit and the Atlantic City deal making him second-guess a perfectly reasonable decision. But then, his phone rang. It was Detective Marcus Webb from the Philadelphia Police Department, and the call changed everything. "Mr. Cole, we need to talk about Maria Santos, your former employee." Richard's heart lurched. "What about her? When did you last see her?" "Last night," Richard said carefully. "Around 10 p.m. I terminated her employment for theft and had her escorted off the property." "Why?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, heavy and ominous. "Because her bag was found this morning near the Schuylkill River. No sign of her. We're treating it as a potential missing persons case. And sir, given the circumstances of her dismissal, we're going to need you to come down to the station for questioning." The phone nearly slipped from Richard's hand. "Missing? What do you mean missing?" "I mean we can't locate her, Mr. Cole. And considering she was last seen leaving your property under duress in the middle of a storm with no transportation and no clear destination, we have some serious concerns about her welfare. We'll need a full statement from you regarding the events of last night." Richard's mind was reeling. Her bag was found by the river? Was she? Did something happen to her? "That's what we're trying to determine," Detective Webb said, his tone professional but edged with suspicion. "So I'll expect you at the station within the next 2 hours. And Mr. Cole, I'd suggest you bring your lawyer." The line went dead. Richard sat frozen in his chair, the phone still pressed to his ear, the detective's words echoing in his skull. "Missing. Bag found by the river. No sign of her." A wave of nausea rolled through him as his imagination filled in the horrifying blanks. What if she'd been so desperate, so hopeless after he threw her out, that she'd done something drastic? What if she'd been attacked, robbed, hurt by someone while wandering the streets alone because of him? What if right now, while he sat in his comfortable study, Maria was lying somewhere injured or worse, and it was entirely his fault? Richard called his lawyer immediately, then spent the next hour and 45 minutes in a state of barely controlled panic, pacing his study, replaying the previous night over and over, seeing Maria's face when he'd accused her, hearing her desperate pleas that he'd ignored. When he arrived at the police station with his attorney, he was ushered into a small interrogation room where Detective Webb was waiting, a thick file folder on the table between them. Richard's lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, sat beside him and immediately took control. "My client is here voluntarily to provide information about Miss Santos's employment and termination. He has nothing to hide and wants to help in any way possible." Detective Webb nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Let's start with why you fired Miss Santos. Richard explained about the missing bracelet, about searching her room and finding it in her nightstand, about giving her 10 minutes to leave. He tried to sound rational, justified, but even to his own ears, the story sounded cruel, excessive. Detective Webb took notes, his pen scratching across paper. And you didn't think to call the police if you believed she'd committed theft? Richard hesitated. I just wanted her gone. I didn't want to ruin her life over one mistake. So you believed she was guilty enough to fire her and throw her out in a storm, but not guilty enough to prosecute? That's an interesting moral line, Mr. Cole. Patricia interjected. Detective, my client showed compassion by not involving law enforcement. He's not on trial here. Webb's gaze shifted to her, then back to Richard. Not yet. Anyway, tell me about your relationship with Miss Santos. Was it purely professional? Richard felt heat creep up his neck. Of course it was professional. She worked for me. Did you ever give her money outside of her salary? Richard's jaw tightened. I gave her an advance once to help with her mother's medical bills. That's not unusual for an employer who values good work. And yet you immediately suspected her of theft, Webb said, leaning forward. Despite her, by your own admission, excellent work ethic and trustworthiness up until this incident. Why was that? Because the evidence was in her room, Richard said, his voice rising slightly. The bracelet was in her nightstand. Where else was I supposed to think it came from? Detective Webb opened his file and slid a photograph across the table. This is the bag we found. Maria's worn leather satchel in the photo, sitting on a muddy riverbank. Contents scattered. A wallet visible with cards spilling out. Do you recognize this? Richard's throat constricted. Yes, that's hers. We found it at around 6 this morning. Wallet still had cash in it, ID, everything. So if someone attacked her for money, they didn't take the obvious valuables. Which makes us wonder what she was doing by that river in the first place. Richard stared at the photograph, his hands clenched beneath the table. I don't know, he whispered. Webb closed the file. Here's what troubles me, Mr. Cole. Young woman gets accused of a crime she insists she didn't commit. Gets thrown out of her home and workplace in the middle of a storm with nowhere to go. And hours later, her belongings turn up abandoned by a river. Now maybe she just panicked, dropped the bag, kept walking. Or maybe something worse happened. Either way, you were the last person to see her. And your actions directly led to her being out there alone and vulnerable. So until we find Miss Santos and verify her safety, you're going to stay very available for further questioning. Do I make myself clear? Richard nodded numbly. Crystal clear. As he left the station with Patricia, cameras were already gathering outside, news crews who'd somehow caught wind of the story. A reporter shoved a microphone toward him. Mr. Cole, is it true you're being investigated in connection with a missing woman? Did you fire a maid for stealing, and now she's disappeared? Patricia pulled him past the cameras toward his car, but Richard caught enough of the shouted questions to understand. This was about to become a media circus, and he was about to become the villain. That night, the story hit the local news. Billionaire, under investigation, after Maid vanishes. The coverage was brutal, painting Richard as a heartless tycoon who'd thrown a vulnerable woman out into danger over an accusation she'd denied. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags like Justice for Maria and Believe Women trending within hours. Protesters began gathering outside the gates of his estate, holding signs and chanting. Richard's business associates started distancing themselves. Meetings were canceled. Investors expressed concerns. His reputation, built over decades, was crumbling in real time. And through it all, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at that diamond bracelet still sitting on his desk, and felt the weight of his choices crushing him. He hadn't slept more than an hour since the detective's call. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maria's face, heard her voice, felt the ghost of his own cruelty echoing back at him. He started going through everything in his mind, looking for inconsistencies, for clues he'd missed. And slowly, painfully, he began to see them. How Veronica had been so insistent on searching Maria's room immediately. How she'd been the one to confirm the bracelet's location that morning. How she'd shown no surprise when they found it in Maria's nightstand, almost as if she'd expected it to be there. Richard pulled up Veronica's employment records, something he should have thought to do immediately but hadn't in his blind trust. He scoured through 5 years of files, payroll records, performance reviews. Everything looked normal until he noticed something odd. Small, irregular withdrawals from petty cash over the past 18 months, always under the threshold that would trigger an audit, always with vague justifications that he'd apparently approved but couldn't remember approving. He checked his bank statements, his credit card records, more irregularities, purchases he didn't recognize, charges to accounts he didn't use, all carefully hidden in the noise of his massive financial portfolio. His hands started shaking as the picture came together. Veronica had been stealing from him for months, maybe years. Small amounts that wouldn't be noticed by someone with his wealth, but significant enough to add up. And when Maria had arrived, diligent and detail-oriented, someone who might eventually notice the discrepancies, Veronica had seen a threat, so she'd framed her, planted the bracelet in Maria's room, and then convinced Richard to search it, knowing exactly what he'd find because she'd put it there. Richard's vision tunneled. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward, rage and guilt and horror churning in his chest. He'd destroyed an innocent woman's life because he'd been too proud, too quick to judge, too blinded by his own assumptions to see what was right in front of him. He grabbed his phone and called Detective Webb. "I need to come back to the station immediately. I have new information about Maria's case." An hour later, Richard was back in the interrogation room, this time with a flash drive full of financial records and a confession that tasted like acid in his mouth. "I was wrong about Maria," he said, his voice hoarse. "I think my assistant, Veronica Hayes, framed her, and I have evidence that Veronica's been embezzling from me for over a year." Detective Webb's expression sharpened. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Cole." Richard slid the flash drive across the table. "It's all there. The withdrawals, the purchases, the timeline. Maria didn't steal that bracelet. Veronica planted it to get rid of her, and I was too stupid to see it. Webb took the drive. We'll look into this. But Mr. Cole, even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't change the fact that Maria Santos is still missing, and every hour that passes makes it less likely we'll find her safe." The words hit Richard like a punch to the chest. "I know," he whispered. "God help me, I know." The police moved fast once they had the evidence. Veronica was brought in for questioning that same night, and under pressure, her story fell apart. She admitted to the embezzlement, admitted to planting the bracelet, claimed she'd just been trying to protect her position, that she'd never meant for things to go this far. She was arrested on charges of theft, fraud, and evidence tampering, but it was cold comfort to Richard because Maria was still missing, and nothing Veronica said gave them any clue about where she'd gone. The media coverage shifted, now painting Richard as a victim of deception, but he didn't feel like a victim. He felt like the villain he'd always been accused of being, because even if Veronica had framed Maria, he had been the one who'd refused to listen, who'd thrown her out without a second thought, who'd let his pride and anger override his judgment. He hired a private investigator to search for Maria, offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to her whereabouts, and released a public statement apologizing for his actions and begging Maria to come forward if she saw the news. But days passed with no leads. A week, then 2. Christmas came and went in a blur of guilt and sleepless nights. Richard stopped going to the office, stopped answering calls from anyone except the detective and his private investigator. His house, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a mausoleum, every room echoing with the ghost of his mistakes. He wandered through the halls at night, haunted by memories of Maria moving quietly through these same spaces, her kindness that he'd taken for granted, her forgiveness that he'd never deserved. He found one of her unsigned notes still tucked in his desk drawer, the one that said, "You're stronger than you think," and he kept it in his pocket like a talisman of everything he'd destroyed. On New Year's Eve, Detective Webb called with an update that made Richard's heart stop. "We found her. She's alive." Richard's legs nearly gave out. "Where?" Is she okay? Can I see her? Slow down, Mr. Cole. She's physically unharmed, but she's been staying at a women's shelter, downtown. She didn't want to be found, didn't want any contact with you or anyone associated with the case. We only located her because someone at the shelter recognized her from the news coverage and convinced her to let us verify her safety. Richard pressed his palm against his desk to steady himself. But she's alive. She's safe. Yes, Webb confirmed. But Mr. Cole, she's made it very clear she wants nothing to do with you. She's cooperating with the investigation against Veronica Hayes, but she's requested that you respect her privacy and stay away from her. I'm telling you this as a courtesy, but also as a warning. If you try to contact her against her wishes, there will be consequences. Do you understand? Richard's throat was so tight he could barely speak. I understand. Can you at least tell her I'm sorry? Tell her I know that's not enough, that nothing will ever be enough. But I'm sorry. There was a pause. I'll pass along the message, but don't expect a response, Mr. Cole. You don't get to demand her forgiveness just because you feel guilty. The line went dead, and Richard collapsed into his chair, relief and grief warring in his chest. She was alive. That was what mattered. She was alive and safe, even if she hated him, even if he never saw her again. At least she was breathing somewhere in the world. But the relief didn't erase the guilt, didn't heal the wound of knowing he'd caused her so much pain. The next 2 months were the longest of Richard's life. Veronica's trial moved forward quickly. Her crimes laid bare in court testimony that made headlines for weeks. Richard testified, admitting his failure to verify the theft accusation, acknowledging how he'd let his assistant manipulate him. The publicity was humiliating but deserved, every article reminding him of his arrogance and his cruelty. His business suffered. Contracts were lost. Partnerships dissolved. But Richard found he didn't care about any of it the way he once would have. The empire he'd spent decades building suddenly felt meaningless compared to the life he'd almost destroyed. He started making changes, quietly at first. He established a fund for wrongfully accused domestic workers, donated to organizations that supported immigrant families, began personally reviewing every termination in his company to ensure no one else suffered what Maria had. It wasn't redemption. He knew that. It was just the bare minimum of trying to be less of a monster than he'd been. But it gave him something to do besides drown in his own shame. In early March, Richard received an unexpected letter. There was no return address, but the handwriting on the envelope made his hands shake. He opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out a single page of notebook paper covered in Maria's careful script. Mr. Cole, I'm writing this because Detective Webb told me you wanted to apologize, and because I've spent the last 3 months trying to decide whether I owe you anything, including this response. I want you to know that what you did to me that night almost broke me completely. I spent hours sitting in that bus shelter in the rain, convinced my life was over, that I'd never recover from being accused of something I didn't do, never get another job, never be able to help my mother. I thought about walking into that river, Mr. Cole. I stood on the bank and stared at the water and wondered if drowning would hurt less than the humiliation and despair I was feeling. The only reason I didn't was because I thought about my mother dying without me there, and I couldn't do that to her. So I dropped my bag because I couldn't carry it anymore and I walked away. I spent that night and the next 3 days at a homeless shelter, pretending to be someone else because I was terrified you'd send the police after me. I eventually made my way to the women's shelter where I've been staying, and they've been kind enough to help me find a new job and start rebuilding my life. I saw the news about Veronica, about what she did to both of us. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt sad. Because even though she framed me, you were the one who chose not to believe me. You were the one who looked at me, someone you'd worked with for months, someone you'd helped and who'd never given you reason to doubt, and decided I was a liar and a thief. That hurt worse than anything Veronica did, because I thought we had some kind of trust, some mutual respect. I was wrong. So I'm writing to tell you that I appreciate your apology, and I'm glad you're trying to do better. But I can't forgive you, Mr. Cole. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because forgiveness isn't something you earn just by feeling bad about what you've done. It's something that comes when the person you hurt feels ready to let go of the pain, and I'm not there yet. I don't know if I'll ever be there. What I can tell you is that I'm going to be okay. I'm working as a caregiver for an elderly woman who treats me with kindness and dignity. My mother's treatment is continuing, and she's responding well. I'm slowly rebuilding my sense of self-worth that you shattered that night, and I'm learning that I'm stronger than I thought I was, stronger than you believed I was. So thank you for the apology, but please don't contact me again. Let me heal without you. Let me move forward without your guilt weighing on me. You need to figure out how to live with what you've done, Mr. Cole, and that's not my responsibility to help you with. I hope you become a better person. I really do. But I hope it from a distance. Take care of yourself. Maria. Richard read the letter 17 times, memorizing every word, every curve of her handwriting. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer next to the note she'd written months ago. And he sat in the silence of his study and let himself cry for the first time since Caroline had died. Not tears of self-pity, but tears of genuine grief, for the pain he'd caused, for the relationship he'd destroyed before it could become anything meaningful, for the person he'd been and the person he was trying desperately to become. Maria was right. He couldn't demand her forgiveness. He didn't deserve it, but he could honor her request, could leave her alone to heal, could use his guilt as fuel to be better, to do better, to make sure no one else ever suffered because of his pride and prejudice. That night, Richard made a decision. He would respect Maria's wishes completely, would never try to contact her or find her again. But he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn a forgiveness he knew he'd never receive, trying to become someone Caroline would have been proud of, someone Maria wouldn't have had to fear. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Spring turned to summer, and Richard threw himself into the work of becoming a better human being with the same intensity he'd once devoted to building his fortune. He began volunteering at homeless shelters, not for publicity but because he couldn't forget the image of Maria spending nights there. Terrified and alone because of him, he met people whose stories broke his heart, people who'd been judged and discarded by a system that valued wealth over humanity, and he started to understand just how sheltered and callous his worldview had been. He hired a new assistant, a young man named David who was honest and straightforward, and he made it clear that he valued integrity over efficiency, that he'd rather hear hard truths than comfortable lies. He restructured his company's employment policies, adding protections for workers, creating an anonymous reporting system for abuse or unfair treatment, funding legal support for any employee who faced discrimination or false accusations. It felt like the least he could do, a tiny step toward balancing the scales he'd tipped so violently against Maria. In August, Richard received an invitation that surprised him. It was for a charity gala benefiting immigrant family services, and the keynote speaker was listed as Maria Santos. His first instinct was to decline immediately, to respect her request for distance. But the event was public, and he'd been a donor to the organization for years before any of this happened. He wrestled with the decision for a week before finally deciding to attend, sitting in the back, planning to leave before the speaking portion if it seemed like his presence would upset her. The gala was held in a downtown hotel ballroom, elegant and understated, filled with people who genuinely seemed to care about the cause. Richard arrived late, slipping into a seat near the back exit, trying to be invisible. And then Maria walked onto the stage, and his breath caught in his chest. She looked different, healthier somehow, her face fuller, her eyes clearer. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before, or maybe had always been there but he'd been too blind to see. She stepped up to the microphone and began to speak, and her voice was steady and strong, nothing like the frightened whisper he remembered from that terrible night. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Maria said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm honored to speak to you about something very personal, my experience as an immigrant worker and a survivor of workplace injustice. 6 months ago, I lost everything in a single night. I lost my job, my home, my reputation, and very nearly my life. I was falsely accused of theft by my employer, someone I trusted and respected, and I was thrown out into the street with nothing but the clothes on my back and the weight of shame I didn't deserve. For weeks, I lived in shelters, afraid to use my own name, terrified of a future that seemed impossibly dark. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Richard felt his throat tighten. But I'm standing here tonight because I survived. Because people in this community, people working for organizations like the one we're supporting tonight, caught me when I fell. They gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go, helped me find work when no one else would hire me, believed me when I said I was innocent, and helped me rebuild my life piece by piece. They taught me that my worth isn't determined by how others see me, but by how I see myself. And they reminded me that one person's cruelty doesn't have to define my entire future. Maria paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, and for just a second, Richard could have sworn her eyes landed on him in the back. But she didn't react, didn't falter, just continued speaking. I'm here tonight to tell you that workplace abuse, false accusations, and the exploitation of vulnerable workers aren't rare exceptions. They're systemic problems that affect thousands of people every year. People who work in our homes, our businesses, our communities, people who have no power to defend themselves when those above them decide to destroy them. And I'm here to tell you that we can do better. We must do better. Because every person deserves dignity in their work, deserves to be believed when they speak their truth, deserves a chance to defend themselves before they're convicted in someone's private court of judgment. The applause started quietly and built to a standing ovation. Richard stood too, his hands shaking as he clapped, tears streaming openly down his face. This was who Maria had always been, brave and principled and unbreakable. And he'd been too arrogant to see it. He'd tried to break her spirit, but she'd survived him, thrived despite him, become something more powerful than she'd been before. And he knew, watching her stand in that spotlight with her head held high, that she'd never needed his forgiveness because she'd never done anything wrong. He was the one who needed redemption, and she'd just shown him that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or public apologies. It was about changing the systems that allowed people like him to wield power without accountability. Richard left before the event ended, not wanting to create an awkward encounter that might diminish Maria's moment. But as he walked out into the warm August night, he pulled out his phone and made a call to his attorney. I want to establish a foundation, he said, a legal defense fund for domestic workers and service employees who've been falsely accused or mistreated by their employers. I want it fully funded, with Maria Santos as the primary consultant and board member if she's willing. And I want it done anonymously. No press, no credit. Just get it set up and present it to her as an opportunity, not as anything from me. Can you do that? His attorney was quiet for a moment. Richard, that's going to cost millions. I know. Do it anyway. It's the least I can do. Actually, no, it's not nearly enough. But it's what I can give. 3 weeks later, Richard received a brief email forwarded through his attorney. It was from Maria, just 3 sentences long. I've been informed about the foundation and the offer to serve on its board. I've accepted, not because of who's funding it, but because the cause matters. Thank you for stepping aside and letting the work speak for itself. That was all. No forgiveness, no reconciliation, no invitation back into her life. But it was acknowledgement, recognition that he was trying, and that was more than he deserved. Richard printed the email and put it in the drawer with her letter and her note. A collection of words that marked his journey from the person he'd been to the person he was becoming. Fall arrived with cooler temperatures and changing leaves, and Richard found himself settling into a new rhythm of life. He still ran his business, but it no longer consumed him the way it once had. He spent his evenings at the shelter, his weekends working with the foundation he'd established, his energy focused on building something meaningful instead of just something profitable. He started therapy, finally addressing the grief over Caroline's death that he'd buried under work and anger, unpacking the ways his own childhood poverty had made him paranoid about betrayal and theft, understanding how his trauma had made him a weapon turned on someone innocent. It was painful work, confronting his demons, but it felt necessary, like lancing an infected wound so it could finally heal. He'd never be the man he should have been for Maria, but maybe he could become the man who wouldn't make the same mistakes again. In October, Richard attended a board meeting for the foundation, his first time being in the same room as Maria since the gala. He sat on the opposite end of the conference table, keeping distance, saying little, letting her lead the discussion about expansion plans and policy recommendations. She was brilliant, articulate, commanding respect from everyone present, and when the meeting ended, she approached him for the first time in months, her expression neutral but not hostile. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "the foundation is doing good work. Thank you for making it possible." Richard's heart hammered in his chest. "It's the least I could do," he managed. "And please, call me Richard. You don't work for me anymore. You never have to call me Mr. Cole again." Maria studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her eyes. "Old habits," she said finally, "but I'll try." They stood in awkward silence for a few seconds, the weight of everything, unsaid, hanging between them. Then Maria spoke again, her voice softer. "I heard you've been volunteering at Vincent's shelter." Richard nodded, surprised she knew. "A few nights a week. It's helped me understand things I should have understood a long time ago." Maria's expression softened slightly. "That's good. Growth is good, even when it comes from pain. Maybe especially then." She paused, then added, "I'm not ready to be friends, Richard. I don't know if I ever will be. But I can see you're trying to be different, and that matters. It doesn't erase what happened, but it matters." "I understand," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I don't expect anything from you, Maria. I just want you to know that you were right about everything. I need to live with what I did, and I'm trying to do that by becoming someone worth forgiving, even if that forgiveness never comes." Maria's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she did something that shocked him. She extended her hand. "Thank you for respecting my boundaries, and thank you for not making this foundation about your redemption. It's about helping people. And that's what matters most." Richard shook her hand carefully, as if she might disappear if he gripped too tightly. "That's all I want it to be." Maria held his gaze for another moment, then released his hand and turned to leave. But at the door, she paused and looked back. "Richard," she said. "Yes, sometimes people surprise us. They become better than we thought they could be. I hope you keep surprising me." Then she was gone, leaving Richard standing alone in the conference room with tears streaming down his face and hope, fragile and new, blooming in his chest for the first time in nearly a year. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever. But it was possibility, and that was something he thought he'd lost forever. The months that followed brought small moments of healing, incremental progress measured not in grand gestures but in quiet consistency. Richard continued his work with the shelter and the foundation, showed up when he said he would, listened more than he spoke, learned from people whose experiences had been invisible to him before. He and Maria maintained a cordial professional relationship through the foundation's work, exchanging emails about policy initiatives, attending quarterly board meetings, acknowledging each other with polite nods and careful smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. But the distance remained, appropriate and necessary. A boundary Maria had set that Richard honored absolutely. He dated briefly, a kind woman named Sarah who worked in nonprofit management, but it felt hollow. His heart still too tangled in guilt and regret to fully open to someone new. He ended it gently after 3 months, recognizing it wasn't fair to be with someone when part of him was still trapped in that December night, still hearing Maria's desperate pleas echoing in his memory. His business continued to stabilize and even grow. But Richard found he cared less about the numbers, more about the culture he was building, a workplace where people felt valued and heard, where mistakes didn't mean immediate termination, where second chances were the norm rather than the exception. Winter came again, marking a full year since that terrible night. Richard woke on the anniversary and couldn't get out of bed for an hour, the weight of memory crushing his chest. He forced himself up eventually, went through his morning routine mechanically, and drove to the office for a meeting he couldn't miss. But his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the past, counting all the ways he'd failed, all the damage he'd caused. That evening, he returned home to find an envelope tucked into his front gate. His name was written on it in Maria's handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it, half expecting a letter telling him she never wanted to see him again, that his presence at the foundation was too painful, that he needed to step back completely. Instead, he found an invitation. It was simple, handwritten on cream cardstock. You're invited to celebrate my mother, Claudia Santos's recovery, and 1 year of being cancer-free. December 20th at my home. No gifts, please. Just your presence if you choose to attend. Richard read it 3 times, his vision blurring. She was inviting him to celebrate her mother's health, to be part of something joyful, despite everything he'd done. It felt impossible, undeserved, like a grace he had no right to receive. He stared at that invitation for hours, terrified of making the wrong choice, of overstepping or hurting her again by showing up where he didn't belong. Finally, he called the one person he trusted to tell him the truth. His therapist listened as he explained the situation, his fear and confusion spilling out in a rush. "What does she want from me?" he asked desperately. "Why would she invite me after everything?" His therapist was quiet for a moment. "Richard, what do you think forgiveness looks like?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "I thought it was saying the words, 'You're forgiven,' like absolution." "Maybe sometimes," his therapist said gently. "But sometimes forgiveness is inviting someone back into the margins of your life not because they've earned it, but because you've decided their presence no longer has the power to hurt you. It's not for them. It's for you. It's choosing peace over punishment. So should I go? That's not for me to decide. But I'll ask you this. If you go, can you show up without expecting anything in return? Can you celebrate her mother's health without making it about your redemption? Can you honor her courage in extending this invitation by being genuinely happy for her, with no ulterior motives?" Richard thought about it, really thought. "Yes," he said finally. "I can do that." "Then you have your answer." On December 20th, Richard drove to the address Maria had provided, a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the city's north side. He'd stopped at a bakery and picked up a simple chocolate cake, nothing ostentatious, just something to contribute without making a statement. His palms were sweating as he walked up the stairs to her door, and he almost turned back 3 times. But he knocked, and a moment later, the door opened. Maria stood there in jeans and a soft green sweater, her hair pulled back, her expression cautious but not cold. "Richard," she said, "you came. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I should," Richard admitted. "But I wanted to celebrate your mother's recovery with you, if that's okay." Maria's smile was small but genuine. "It's okay. Come in." The apartment was small but warm, filled with the smell of cooking and the sound of quiet conversation. A dozen people were scattered through the living room and kitchen, laughing and talking, a mixture of ages and backgrounds. And in the center of it all, sitting in a comfortable chair with a blanket across her lap, was an older woman who had to be Claudia. She was thin, but her eyes were bright, her smile radiant as she talked with a young man who was showing her pictures on his phone. Maria led Richard over. "Mama, this is Richard Cole. He's someone I work with on the foundation. Richard, this is my mother, Claudia." Claudia looked up at him, and Richard saw the moment recognition flickered in her eyes. She knew who he was, what he'd done, but her expression remained kind as she extended a frail hand. "Mr. Cole, it's nice to meet you. Maria has told me about the work you've been doing. Please, call me Richard," he said, taking her hand gently. "And congratulations on your recovery. It's wonderful news." Claudia's grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you. It's been a hard year, but we made it through. My Maria is very strong, you know. She's been taking such good care of me." "I know," Richard said, his voice thick. "She's one of the strongest people I've ever met." Claudia studied him for a long moment, then patted his hand. "People make mistakes, Richard. What matters is whether we learn from them. I hope you've been learning." "Every day," he said honestly. "I'm trying every day." Claudia nodded, satisfied, and released his hand. "Then welcome to our home. Make yourself comfortable." The evening unfolded gently, conversations flowing easily, food shared family style around a small table that somehow fit everyone when chairs were pulled close. Richard found himself talking with Maria's cousin, the one who'd originally told her about the housekeeping job. And the irony wasn't lost on him. He listened to stories about Maria's childhood, her kindness even as a young girl, her determination to make something of herself despite limited opportunities. And through it all, Richard watched Maria move through her home, laughing with friends, hugging her mother, radiating a joy and peace he'd never seen in her when she worked for him. She'd built this life from the ruins he'd left her in, created this community, found this happiness, and she'd done it without him, in spite of him. It was humbling and heartbreaking and beautiful all at once. Later, as the party was winding down and guests were leaving, Richard helped Maria clean up, washing dishes while she put away leftover food. They worked in comfortable silence for a while before Maria spoke. "Thank you for coming tonight, and for not making it weird." Richard dried a plate, carefully. "Thank you for inviting me. I wasn't sure I deserved to be here." Maria was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure deserve is the right word anymore. I invited you because I wanted to see if I could be in the same space as you without feeling that fear and anger I carried for so long. And I can. You're not the monster I thought you were that night. You're just a person who made terrible choices and is trying to do better. That's more nuanced, more human, and I can live with human." Richard's hands stilled in the dishwater. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that grace, Maria. I know what I took from you, and I know I can never give it back. But I promise I'll keep trying to be someone who makes the world better instead of worse." Maria set down the container she was holding and turned to face him. "Richard, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it." Richard nodded, bracing himself. "What happened between us changed me," she said slowly. "It broke something in me that took months to repair. But it also taught me things about myself I might never have learned otherwise. It taught me I'm resilient, that I can survive the worst night of my life and come out the other side stronger. It taught me the importance of the work we're doing with the foundation, because I lived what so many others live and most people never talk about. And it taught me that holding on to anger and pain only hurts the person carrying it." She took a breath. "So I'm choosing to let it go. Not because you've earned forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. I'm choosing to see you as someone who made mistakes and is genuinely trying to grow from them. That doesn't mean we're friends. That doesn't mean I trust you the way I did before. That might never come back. But it means I can stand here washing dishes with you in my home and feel okay about it. And that's enough for now." Richard's vision blurred with tears. "Maria." He started, but his voice broke. She reached over and squeezed his arm briefly. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep being better. That's all any of us can do." They finished cleaning in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Less heavy, more hopeful. When the kitchen was clean, Richard said his goodbyes to Claudia, who hugged him with surprising strength and whispered, "Take care of yourself, Richard. We're all just trying to find our way." Maria walked him to the door, and they stood in the doorway for a moment, the cold December air swirling around them. "Thank you again," Richard said, "for tonight, for everything. You didn't have to extend this kindness, and I'll never forget that you did." Maria smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "Merry Christmas, Richard. Drive safely." "Merry Christmas, Maria," he replied. "And Happy New Year. To both of us." As he walked down the stairs and back to his car, Richard felt something shift inside him, like a locked door finally opening, like lungs expanding after being compressed for too long. It wasn't absolution, wasn't the dramatic moment of forgiveness he'd sometimes imagined. It was quieter than that, more real. The simple recognition that people are complex and capable of change, that mercy is possible even when it's not required, that healing happens not in grand gestures but in small moments of choosing peace over pain. He drove home through streets decorated with Christmas lights, and for the first time in over a year, Richard felt like maybe, just maybe, he could forgive himself. Not because he deserved it, but because holding on to his own guilt served no one, helped no one, changed nothing. He could honor Maria's grace by becoming the person she'd chosen to see the potential for, by continuing the work they'd started, by making sure her suffering led to something meaningful that protected others. That night, Richard sat in his study and wrote a letter he'd never send, pouring out everything he felt, all the gratitude and regret and hope. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with Maria's letters and note, a collection of words that told the story of his worst moment and his long climb back toward humanity. And he made a promise to himself and to Caroline's memory and to Maria's courage that he would spend the rest of his life proving that people can change, that one terrible night doesn't have to define a lifetime, that redemption isn't about erasing the past but about building a better future despite it. Because Maria had shown him that grace isn't something you earn through grand gestures or perfect behavior. It's something freely given by people who've survived your worst and chosen to see your potential anyway. And the only way to honor that grace is to become someone worthy of it. One difficult choice, one act of kindness, one moment of genuine growth at a time. So what do you think? If you were in Maria's position, could you have extended that invitation? Could you have chosen peace over anger after everything she went through? And if you were Richard, would you have had the courage to show up, to face the person you'd wronged so deeply? These questions matter because they're not just about a billionaire and his former maid. They're about all of us, about how we handle betrayal and injustice, about whether we believe people can truly change, about what forgiveness really means and who it's really for. This story reminds us that the people we dismiss, the ones we see as beneath us or less important, they're the ones who might teach us the most important lessons about strength and grace and what it really means to be human. Maria didn't forgive Richard because he deserved it. She forgave him because she deserved to be free from the weight of that night. And in doing so, she gave him the greatest gift anyone can give, the chance to become better than he was. Let me know in the comments what you think about this story, about Maria's choice, about whether Richard's efforts were enough, or if some actions are simply unforgivable. And if you found this story moving, if it made you think about your own life and the way you treat people who have less power than you, then please subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories like this. Stories that challenge us to be better, to see deeper, to understand that everyone we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Thank you for watching, and remember, the measure of a person isn't found in their worst moment, but in everything they do afterward to make amends for it. Take care of each other out there, and I'll see you in the next video.